My name is Rose Batt. I've been a faculty member at the ILR school since 1995. And now I hold the Alice Hansen Cook Professorship on Women in Work. For a long time, ever since I came to the ILR school, I knew that women had been very important in the founding of the school. And so finally this year, I decided it was time to start a research project on the founding women of ILR. So today, in our first conversation, we're going to be speaking with Lois Gray, who was one of the founding members of ILR, along with two undergraduate students who joined me this summer to do research on the founding women. And so I have with us Alison Blankstein and Gayathri Kaikumar. So we hope to have a great conversation just delving into what Allison and Gayathri learned, and also the memories that Lois had from her many years at ILR. So we're going to start with, I'd like to start with Gayathri, because she did a lot of research in the archives on the history of the founding of the school. Gayathri, do you want to talk to me a little bit about some of the interesting things you found in your research?
So one of the first thing I found in my research was the mission of the school, and I thought that was probably the most interesting thing regarding the founding of the school, because the mission is so unconventional, and the proponents of the school took it sorry.
Okay.
It was unconventional, and the proponents of the school thought really highly of it. So the founder, Irving Ives, wanted to create a school with a public-oriented mission. So the three main components of that would be conducting research about labor relations, disseminating information to the public, and also educating labor and management, trying to create mutual understanding between the two parties. So not many colleges, in my opinion, can say that they were formed out of the Joint Legislative Committee's ideals of improving the political, social, and economic conditions of the United States. So I thought that made the ILR school definitely unique.
Mm-hmm. And could I ask you, what did you get a sense of why they needed to form this school? What was going on at the time that made it so important?
So at the time, it was founded in 1945. So before 1945, at the time, there was a lot of labor tension, labor management tension in New York, in the state of New York, and this Joint Legislative Committee wanted to, do something about this tension, do something about the strikes occurring, and what they found was that there was a lack of facilities, there was a lack of education among both parties, and eventually, there was disputes around where the school should be located, but the one commonality was, that this school should definitely exist, and this school is needed for the state of New York.
Mm-hmm. Great. And could you tell me a little bit about you did some research on early women who were active at the school. Could you talk a little bit about some of them?
So yes, these women were greatly involved in the early years of the school, and they were passionate about labor education and the labor movement itself. So some of these women were Jean McKelvey, Eleanor Emerson, Effie Riley, and Alice Grant. And what I thought was the most interesting, learning about them, was not just their passions, but also how they work together. And what I found specifically was the intimate nature among the faculty and within the school itself, and that really stuck out to me, because you have professors like Alice Cook, who is just so involved in the life of her students, and involved in the school itself, and to the point where her students would call her Aunt Alice, which I thought was very interesting and almost funny, but it kind of just told how the reality of what was happening in the ILR school. The women professors were so intimate with each other and close and fostered close relationships. So, in another sense, they also, hired each other, which Lois will be talking about today too. So they hired each other, and in that way they kind of also looked out for each other, which I thought was very interesting. And I'm excited to hear more real life accounts of this happening in the school.
Great. So I want to turn to you, Allison, because you actually worked with Lois on her biography, and went back and forth and did some archival work as well. So could you tell me a little bit about what you found interesting in the research you did?
Sure. I got to interview Lois Gray many times. I know so much about her life, about her stories. I learned about her life and career, starting from the beginning. I learned about how she transitioned from the NLRB to establishing the ILR Extension Office in Buffalo, which is so important for real applicable change and information for both labor and management. I learned about her transition from the Buffalo office to the ILR Extension in New York City, and how she really built that up to what it is today, which has about 50 to has over 50 employees, and does some great work in the metropolitan area. And I learned about how about the different projects that she did, many including many that apply to social justice, such as creating and helping to create the Institute of Women at Work and the Puerto Rican Workers Project. And I thought it was great to learn from such a prominent labor educator and scholar and researcher and activist, and it was a privilege to get to know her over the summer.
Great. So, Lois, now that you've heard the research, and I know you've read Gayathri's and Allison's papers, could you reflect a little bit on your experience? Because you were hired in 1946 at the Buffalo office. And can you talk a little bit about what it was like and how that happened? Yeah.
Yes, well, as Allison pointed out, I was working as a field examiner with the National Labor Relations Board in Buffalo when I read in the New York Times that a School of Industrial Relations was being founded at Cornell, and I was very excited to read that. At the time, I had a bachelor's degree with a major in economics, and I hoped to go on to a graduate degree. So then I learned from our regional director that the two first faculty members of the ILR school would be coming to Buffalo because, and in keeping with the mission, we're bound to start an extension off-campus program to reach practitioners in the field, in addition to the on-campus, which was designed to educate younger students, and was part of the mission. And they decided on Buffalo, which was a leading industrial city, as a place where they would start their off-campus work. And when I learned that this meeting was taking place in our office, I asked the regional director if he would introduce me to them, because I wanted to inquire about graduate work. And so he invited me to sit in on the meeting, and when I met them and expressed my interest, they said, well, we don't have a graduate program yet, but we need to get an extension program in Buffalo. And since you are now acquainted with labor and management leaders in Buffalo, you can help us do that. Would you take a leave of absence and come with us? And I thought I was going, just for a year. And I thought, well, that's a great opportunity. Sure. I agreed right away.
And you were 22 years old.
Yes.
And so at 22, you were going to become the director of the Buffalo office,
Yes.
and you stayed there for
9 years.
For 9 years.
Yeah.
And you have been at the ILR school for
71. Almost 72.
72 years.
Yeah.
A long and illustrious career you've had.
I thought it was 1 year, it turned out.
You thought it would be 1 year, and it was 72, yeah.
Yeah.
So, what about who hired you, and then talk a little bit about the women that you were getting to know and how the school hired so many talented women at this early period.
Yeah. Well, Morris Neufeld and Jean McKelvey, I think particularly Jean pushed for me, but I think they both recommended me. And I was interviewed by Irving Ives, the dean, and it was a temporary job put on for that 1 year. But in that same period, of course, there was a desire to build up a staff to work in extension. And Jean McKelvey knew Effie Riley, who was a public school teacher in Rochester, but had had experience during the Depression working for the WPA Worker Education Program and the Bryn Mawr School for Workers. Jean knew that. And so Effie was then hired to work out of Ithaca.
Could I ask you, the WPA Workers Education Project, what did that consist of?
Well, as part of the Worker Progress Administration, which was designed to put people back to work, one component of it had arts as one of its components, but one of the components was worker education. And at one point, there were 2 million workers enrolled in worker education programs all over the United States. And one of the leading educators in that program was Eleanor Emerson, who was recommended by Effie Riley. After she came on board, she said, we must get Eleanor Emerson, who is one of the leading labor educators. And So Eleanor brought her vast experience in worker education to ILR and also worked out of Ithaca. Both Eleanor and Effie were mentors to me. I had no experience in worker education or adult education. I knew the subject of industrial relations for being a field examiner. I knew a lot about it, and but they trained me in like how to build a program, Effie particularly on how to build a program, and Eleanor and how to educate adults, how to learn about their needs and adapt to their needs.
And then, do you know where Eleanor was raised or what her background was?
She's from Buffalo.
She's from Buffalo.
She was from Buffalo, as a matter of fact. It came in handy to me. I met my husband and got married in Buffalo, and I was looking for a Presbyterian church where my father could perform the marriage, and Eleanor Emerson stepped up to the plate and introduced me to the pastor of her church. Effie Riley was also serving as my surrogate mother there. The two of them actually took me under the wing. But she was from an old family in Buffalo who were Standard Oil millionaires.
And then she made a commitment to
the workers
movement and to labor education.
Yeah.
And can you tell me a little bit about the Bryn Mawr program? Because that's one of the areas we'd like to do more research in.
Yes. Well, there was a group of women, which included Eleanor Roosevelt, who in the early 20th century, in the 1900s, formed first a consumer league, and then they formed the Trade Union and Women's League, and they aligned themselves with garment workers and other women who were working in factories. And they conducted some education courses around the New York area, but they worked with Bryn Mawr, the elite woman's school, to set up an on-campus summer school, the first ever, for factory workers to go for a full-week program, and several different groups went during the summer, which carried on for quite a number of years. And that actually laid the groundwork, I think, for the WPA program.
Right. And then, is it true then that the ILR school labor education programs in some way were inspired by that history?
Yes, definitely. Well, certainly when we formed the Institute on Women and Work and Cornell was responsible for starting the Union Women's Summer Schools, which now have been in existence for 40 years. And that was definitely inspired by the Bryn Mawr. We were aiming to emulate Bryn Mawr all over the United States. And we started it in the Northeast region, and it's continued going, still going for 40 years in 4 different regions of the United States every year.
Wow. Wow. So we've heard about Jean McKelvey, who was a professor of labor and particularly excellent in arbitration and negotiations. And then she hired you, and then
she recommended Effie.
And then Eleanor Emerson came on.
Yeah, Effie recommended Eleanor. And then a few years later, I believe it was in the early 50s, the ILR school was offered a grant by Ford Foundation to study a study and action project on unions and community organizations, to look at how they work together, if they did, or encourage them to work together. And Eleanor Emerson thought of Alice Cook, who had also worked in that worker education movement. Another worker education for women was the YWCA. And Alice had worked also in the YWCA, and so had Eleanor Emerson. So those are precursors of the kind of work we did at Cornell.
Right, and so when did Alice come on board?
I believe it was 52. And she, at the time, was in Germany, which you mentioned earlier, that she went there with American military government because she had experience in Germany going there for her graduate work earlier, before the rise of Hitler. And she went back to reestablish labor education in Germany to strengthen the German trade unions. And she had been doing that work, but she agreed to come back to the U.S. and take charge of this research action project, which was an extension. Later on, she was appointed to a resident faculty, a professorship.
Right. Yes. So I remember from reading her autobiography, which was called A Lifetime of Labor, which is so fitting, that she went over to Germany in the late 20s under the Weimar Republic to study the workers' education movement, because that was a strong underpinning for developing leadership skills and professional skills for workers, so that they could become leaders and undertake collective bargaining and negotiation, is my understanding. Is that
yes,
right?
And she put that to work in the labor movement. She worked for union, particularly, I believe, these textile workers.
Right, in the 1930s.
Yes, in the 30s, yes. And she married a labor leader from the textile workers. Both of them went to Europe. She went to Germany, and he went to Austria to help reestablish the labor unions and their labor education program.
After World War II.
After World War II.
Right.
And then she came back to Cornell and made a big splash. I mean, she was very well thought of and impressed the dean and the faculty, and she was recruited then as a full professor. She was given tenure right away as a professor in the ILR school. These were all my mentors, all of them that I've mentioned. Jean McKelvey, Alice Cook, I would say were my 2 lead mentors for many, many years. And I learned, as I said before, from Effie Riley and Eleanor Emerson about labor education.
And then later, I believe Alice Grant.
We recruited Alice Grant. I did, though I was introduced to her by Jean McKelvey. I was in charge of the Western District Office, which encompassed not only Buffalo, but Rochester, Jamestown, and all of Western New York. And the largest union in Rochester was the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, and Alice Grant was the education director of that union, and was doing some very creative programs, and we worked together on creating even newer and more innovative programs. For example, one was that we recruited I'm blanking on his name now. I taught the American Ideals course at Cornell. You know, I mean, yeah.
That's all right.
On the faculty. But imagine that the Joint Board of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, these older men who were tailors, you know, all their lives, were studying American Ideal, Milton Convents.
Oh, Milton.
Milton Convents. And so that was our idea, that we would try that, because that was the ideal audience. And so also Clyde Summers, who was a professor at the law school in Buffalo, and I had recruited him as a teacher for the Buffalo program. And he went there and taught another philosophic course about American history and how it evolved. He had these tailors all entranced. And so anyway, that's how I met Alice Grant, and I was very much impressed with her. And so when I had the opportunity, there was an opening, I recommended her to be hired in Extension, and we opened a Rochester office eventually, and she was the director of that.
That's great. So do you remember, Gayathri talked about the mission of the school.
Yeah.
And do you remember the kinds of conversations you all had, Alice and Eleanor and Jean and you and Effie, about what you were really trying to accomplish with labor education? I mean, what did you hope to accomplish in the
Well, I think at
programs?
the very beginning, our goal was primarily not just public relations, but that dissemination to the public, which you mentioned as a mission, like to educate the general public about industrial relations and its importance in their lives. And so we had open public programs with lectures, resident faculty lectures, and we recruited, with help from Jean particularly, I recruited some of the leading names from New York City to come up and speak. And we had big, big lectures, public lectures. So our original was to educate the public and to alert the practitioner community that we were reaching out now, that we're going to have an outreach and an extension program. But our next mission, as we tried to focus more in on that practitioner community, labor and management, was to improve their knowledge about the subject, and there was some emphasis on trying to encourage cooperative relationships, not exclusively that at all, but that was a goal of the mission, and so we had that in mind, and we offered the public programs were more specific. Labor law would be a course rather than a big public lecture, and we would limit the enrollment. And then we moved more to programs designed for individual organizations and their leaders. The next layer of that outreach was, because we had many more requests than we could even fill. By the way, at that time, all of our courses were free. No,
Great.
The state supported our doing this without any charge. And so, of course, we were piling up requests, and as we had more success and the word got out, we moved with that was Eleanor Emerson's idea, to training trainers. That within each organization, particularly the larger one, we would help them develop the curriculum, and then we would train them in educational methods so that they could do their own training, and then we would move on to other organizations or to higher levels of leadership. So that's kind of a sequence of goals. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
Uh-huh.
So the other thing I really wanted to understand is there was this group of women really working in a man's world.
Yes,
Because
yeah.
industrial relations, collective bargaining,
Yeah.
labor and
Yeah,
employment law were
yeah.
largely
Yeah.
fields dominated
Yeah.
by men.
Right, definitely.
So what were some of the challenges, and
Yeah.
how did you help each other overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah. That's, well, like, for example, when I was with the National Labor Relations Board, I was the only female on that regional staff, and so it showed, that was a male profession. And Jean McKelvey, when she went to, she couldn't get in Harvard because women weren't allowed. She went to Radcliffe, but could take courses over at Harvard, and she'd be the one or two people in her economics class, and she excelled. But so we'd all had some experience working in the all-male world, and I think we were well aware. Although at the ILR school, I can't say that I felt that I was ever put down by the male faculty. And the first dean, Irving Ives, who didn't stay long, he ran for Senate after that. And MP Catherwood was really the first real dean who stayed. Took an interest in me, and I think he actually was very open to having females on faculty, which was helpful. Yeah.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So the values of support for labor and working people sounds like they extended to support for women as well.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I know. If you met him, MP Catherwood, you wouldn't see him as that type of person. He would, he was. He'd worked with Governor Dewey. Had been a Republican cabinet member. He was a rather gruff type of person, and many members of the faculty were in fear of him because he would had an imperious manner. But he actually had very strong social values, and I think he valued the women on faculty. Although now that I think of it, Jean did experience discrimination. I just remembered that. The reason given for paying her less than Morris was that she lived in Rochester, but she carried the same teaching load, and if anything, she met with more students than Morris or anybody else. She was always known as the one who took such an interest in the students. But since she lived off campus, that was a rationale for paying her less. So that was an act of discrimination against a woman. She lived in Rochester, her husband lived there, but she commuted in and stayed during the week.
So, but other than that, you don't know that.
Yeah, but as far as the way we were treated, and I would say with respect, we were treated with respect.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And so I want to just have a couple more conversations about the way that women interacted, and then I want to get back to Gayathri and Allison and some of their reflections on what you have been saying. Are there specific ways that the women helped each other? If you had, you didn't have cell phones then. You didn't have email. You didn't have these kinds of communications. So how did you get back and forth? How often did you see one another? Because some of you were located in Buffalo or in Ithaca or in Rochester. How did you put it all together?
Well, I'll illustrate by my own cases to the mentoring that I got from all of these women. Both Effie and Eleanor were specifically assigned to kind of keep an eye on Buffalo, and they came regularly. So they were there for me, and they, at the beginning, went out with me on meetings so I could learn from them how they were handling situations, and could consult with them at any one time about what to do. So that was one way. In the case of Jean McKelvey, who lived in Rochester, which was part of my district, when I went to Rochester, I looked her up very often. Also, when I went on campus, I would be with her. And she, for example, took me to the first founding meeting of the what was called the Industrial Relations Research Association back then, IRRA, which is now known as LIRA. So I'm a founding member of LIRA because I went to that first meeting with Jean. So, and that was a mentoring. Like, she took me. I was not, like a top professor who were the main people who came to those meetings, but she was, cluing me in. She always, would introduce me to big name people in the field, and I could learn from them, and they would know about me and be helpful. And so that illustrates. And with Alice Cook, from the time she came on and lived in Ithaca, she always wanted me to stay in her house every time I came on campus. And so I, actually shared her home and her thoughts, and learned a great deal that way. Yeah.
And then a little bit later, Frances Perkins came to be a visiting professor here.
Yes.
Is that right? Were you around campus much when she was here?
Yeah, I met her, but she was recruited by Alice Cook.
Again, so Alice was instrumental in bringing Frances Perkins
Yeah,
here.
she brought her there. And through Alice, I met Frances Perkins a number of times. And she made, quite an impact. She had quite an impact on faculty. The students were thrilled to have her there. She even lived in one of the dorms with students. Yeah, so she loved being with the students.
Right, right. So let's just circle back to you, Gayathri, after you've heard a little bit about what Lois has said. What are your thoughts, perhaps about what the next steps are in our research project?
Yeah, no, I think it's great to hear stories about, a network of women contributing to the growth of ILR, and I think just hearing what Lois said reminds me of the evolution of ILR and how it's grown from, 1945 to present day. What I recall is Jean McKelvey. She was very adamant about, ILR doing field work and contributing to the overall mission, and I honestly think we still see that today at ILR through programs like, FEX and WISP and credit internships. So it's very interesting to see, your stories and the impact of those women and relate it to what is happening now at ILR.
Because now we have lots of opportunities for service learning. You can go do an internship in India.
Yeah.
There's a very outstanding paid internship program in Buffalo each summer, right? And then there are opportunities to go to Zambia, and we've been building out programs in Europe. So there are really increasing opportunities for students to help both in this country and around the world.
I do want to add this point that at the very beginning, I think this was Jean's idea, it was required that every student should get experience working for labor, management, and government before graduating. That requirement was dropped because it was very hard to find placements for everybody. And so it's made voluntary rather than a requirement. But so from the very beginning, there was that expectation that students would learn not only from books and from exams and from lectures and classes, but from actual experience. Yeah.
Great. And Allison, what do you have other ideas or reflections that come out of this conversation?
Yes, I thought that my research was very interesting. I learned so much. I think it was very important because I think that women's history and achievements are often overlooked or not studied in depth. And I learned so much about the importance of mentorship for women's networks. And I think that it has great potential to we could learn so much more about these amazing women who did so many great things. So I think.
Great. So I think we can wrap up this conversation, but I want to just say that this has been a great start for our research project. And we have the ILR Women's Caucus, which is a great group on campus devoted to advancing the interests and the careers of women. And so what I hope to do now is to carry this research forward. We've begun to learn about the women in the founding. We have had female faculty throughout the history of ILR, and the extension program certainly has been really built out by women I think we can really see that from the founding stories, that it was the women who were out in the field really connecting with the labor movement and providing worker education. So I think we can really now move our research to the 50s and the 60s and 70s up until the current day, and I hope that we will continue to have great undergraduate researchers participating in this project. So thank you, Allison and Gayathri, and
Thank you.
Lois,
Yeah,
thank
yeah.
you so much.
Yeah.